exploring the conversion of Greeks to Buddhism, a forgotten chapter. When I first came across this ancient Buddhist inscription etched into a rock in eastern Afghanistan, I found myself drawn into a fascinating blend of cultures that seemed almost improbable at first glance. The inscription reads, Namo obodo Namo u, a formula that Buddhists have been chanting for centuries as an expression of devotion. What struck me wasn't just the message, but how it was delivered. You see, this isn't written in Sanskrit or Pali, the traditional languages of Buddhist devotion. Instead, it's a rough transliteration of Sanskrit into an ancient Greek script, specifically Greco-Bactrian. That's when I knew I had stumbled onto something deeper than just an old inscription. It was a historical bridge between worlds. Now, the reason this got my attention is that we rarely think of Buddhism and Greek culture crossing paths. But here it was, in stone, a testament to a rich exchange that occurred centuries ago. The script itself is based on the Greek alphabet, though it's written in cursive and carved on a rock, which makes it tricky to decipher. Still, if you look closely, you'll recognize some familiar Greek letters, like the omega, right there. But how, you might ask, did we end up with a Greco-Bactrian Buddhist mantra in the middle of Afghanistan? It's an unexpected outcome of Alexander the Great's vast conquests. After all, Alexander wasn't just a military leader, he was a vehicle for cultural exchange. By the time he swept through Central Asia and reached the Indus River, he had introduced the Greek language, philosophy, and urban living to the populations he conquered. It wasn't a one-way street, though. Buddhism, a relatively new religion at the time, had already begun making its mark in the region by the time Alexander's armies arrived. The fusion that followed, what we now sometimes call Greco-Buddhism, is a unique cultural mix that shows how interconnected the ancient world was. It's easy to forget just how globalized certain parts of the ancient world had already become. The Greeks, especially in places like modern-day Afghanistan, didn't just bring their own ideas. They were also absorbing local philosophies and religions, like Buddhism, which had been evolving in the region after the Buddha's death, around 100 to 150 years before Alexander showed up. But there's more to this story. The Greeks in this region didn't just pass through. Some of them stayed, and even converted to Buddhism. The relationship between the Mediterranean Greek world and the cultures of what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India goes back even further, as far as the 500s BCE. One of the earliest accounts we have of this contact comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who mentions an explorer named Scylax. This guy sailed for the Persian ruler Darius I down the Indus River, connecting Greek explorers with the region long before Alexander's conquest. And then there's the archaeological evidence. Greek coins have been found all over the region, serving as markers of trade and cultural interaction. These tiny, everyday objects carry stories of exchange between vastly different worlds. For centuries, these cultural encounters quietly shaped the development of both Buddhism and the local Greek-speaking communities. It's incredible to think that a simple inscription on a rock can open up such a wide window into history. It's fascinating how the mingling of cultures doesn't just stop at cities and architecture, but permeates even the way people think. When Alexander the Great arrived in these regions, he didn't just bring soldiers and military tactics, he brought a whole entourage of philosophers, thinkers, and artists. Imagine that! A massive war campaign that also doubled as a philosophical road trip. One of the most interesting figures to emerge from this cultural exchange was the philosopher Pyrrho of Elis. Pyrrho, like other Greek philosophers of his time, was intrigued by the wisdom and practices of the East. He traveled with Alexander's army, venturing deep into India and spending a considerable amount of time in places like Taxila, which is now in modern Pakistan. Taxila was a major center of learning and philosophy, a melting pot of Indian and Greek thought. Here, Pyrrho met a group referred to in the ancient texts as the Gymnosophists, or naked wise men. These sages practiced asceticism, and while we don't know for sure if they were Buddhists, it's highly possible, given the timing and the cultural landscape. It's what Pyrrho took from his experiences that's really intriguing. According to ancient sources like Diogenes Laertius, Pyrrho returned to Greece with a radically new way of thinking, one that sounded a lot like some of the core tenets of Buddhism. His philosophy was based on the idea of ataraxia, or mental tranquility, achieved by suspending judgment about the world around us. He suggested that nothing is inherently good or bad, just or unjust. This kind of radical detachment from dualistic thinking is strikingly similar to Buddhist teachings, which encourage followers to rise above the constant judgments and labels we place on things in our everyday lives. Whether or not Pyrrho was directly influenced by Buddhism or by other Indian philosophical traditions like Jainism or Hinduism remains up for debate. But the fact that he brought back such an Eastern-sounding philosophy after his time in India speaks volumes about the depth of cultural exchange during this period. It's easy to imagine Pyrrho sitting cross-legged, conversing with Indian sages, slowly realizing that the nature of reality might be more flexible than the rigid categories he'd been taught to believe in back home. Pyrrho's philosophical approach, which came to be known as Pyrrhonism, emphasized skepticism, specifically the idea that humans cannot know anything for certain. He argued that all of our perceptions and beliefs are subjective, shaped by individual experiences and social conditioning. In many ways, this mirrors the Buddhist idea of impermanence and the unreliability of the self. Pyrrho's philosophy encouraged a kind of mental freedom, where one could live without the constant struggle of trying to categorize and judge everything. This mindset, he believed, would lead to a life free from anxiety and worry, much like the Buddhist concept of nirvana, a state of liberation from suffering. As Pyrrhonism developed, it would continue to resonate throughout the ancient world. While it may not have been mainstream compared to other schools of Greek thought like Stoicism or Epicureanism, it undoubtedly planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who came into contact with it. Whether those seeds sprouted into deeper philosophical inquiry or not, the fact remains that this cross-pollination of ideas between Greece and India had a profound impact on the intellectual landscape of the time. This convergence of Greek and Buddhist thought is a powerful example of how cultural exchange doesn't just change cities or economies, it transforms entire ways of thinking. The cities built by Alexander and his successors, like Alexandria on the Oxus, weren't just outposts of Greek civilization, they became breeding grounds for new ideas, where East met West and philosophy itself evolved. As much as we often think of ancient empires as rigid and isolated, the truth is far more fluid. Alexander's conquests might have been military in nature, but the real legacy of his empire lies in the ways it fostered connections between cultures that might never have interacted otherwise. And sometimes, those connections result in something as powerful as a philosophical shift, where the boundaries of knowledge, tradition, and belief are forever expanded. Translate the concept of dharma, a term that holds a deep and complex meaning in Buddhism. By choosing the Greek word eusebeia, Ashoka's translators were attempting to bridge the philosophical gap between these two cultures. It's an interesting choice, because eusebeia isn't an exact match for dharma, but it conveys the closest approximation of moral duty, religious devotion, and respect for the cosmic order that would resonate with a Greek-speaking audience. This was no small feat. Translating profound, culturally specific ideas like dharma into another language, especially one with a different philosophical heritage, takes more than just linguistic skill. It requires an understanding of how people think and live in that world. Imagine what this cultural exchange looked like on the ground. Buddhist monks, likely from Ashoka's court, traveling into Hellenistic cities, engaging with philosophers, priests, and local leaders, all while trying to explain concepts like non-attachment and compassion. It's easy to think of Buddhism as an insulated Eastern philosophy, but the spread of ideas between India and the Mediterranean during this period was anything but one-sided. Just as Pyrrho's skepticism may have been influenced by his encounters with Indian thought, these Buddhist missionaries were working to make their philosophy understandable and relevant to the Greek worldview. Ashoka's edicts, carved into stone for all to see, give us a rare insight into how serious he was about spreading Buddhist ethics. His references to Hellenistic kings like Antiochus II and Ptolemy II are more than just name-dropping. These mentions show that Ashoka wasn't simply content to focus inward on his own empire. He was reaching out to the broader world, deliberately engaging with the global powers of his time. If he wasn't exaggerating, which, to be fair, rulers of any age often do, then Buddhism was already being introduced to the West as early as the 3rd century BCE. I've always been fascinated by the way personal transformations can ripple out to create broader change, especially when it comes to leadership. Take Ashoka, for example. He started out as a ruthless conqueror, his early reign marked by brutal campaigns, the most notorious being the conquest of Kalinga. It's hard to grasp just how devastating it was. Thousands upon thousands of lives lost, families shattered. It was the same event that became a pivotal moment for him. It was the sheer horror of the bloodshed that led him to rethink everything, pushing him to turn toward Buddhism and embrace nonviolence. What strikes me most about Ashoka's transformation is how genuine it was. It wasn't just a shift in personal belief, it changed how he ruled. Instead of continuing to expand his empire through war, he focused on spreading dharma, or ethical living. His remorse was real, and his edicts, these inscriptions carved on rocks and pillars, are still around today, showing us his commitment to compassion, tolerance, and respect for all life. There's one phrase that stuck with me: compassion and sadness overcame him. It's rare to see a ruler so openly express regret, let alone build his legacy around it. And Ashoka didn't stop at feeling bad. He actively spread these values far and wide, not by force, but by persuasion. That's where it gets really interesting. He sent out messengers, not just to neighboring lands, but as far west as Greece and Egypt, translating Buddhist principles into concepts that would resonate with those cultures. It was diplomacy through dialogue, not domination. This approach wasn't just strategic, it showed his deep understanding of how lasting change happens, not through coercion, but through relevance. He knew people wouldn't adopt new beliefs unless they made sense within their own frameworks, and he respected that. Now, when I think about cultural exchange, it's easy to imagine it as a one-way street, with ideas flowing from one culture to another. But the reality was more complex. There was this dynamic back and forth where both traditions were enriched. Buddhism wasn't just exported to the West, it absorbed elements of Greek philosophy and Persian influences along the way. And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's full of these unexpected connections. Even the representation of the Buddha in human form is an example of how these exchanges reshaped religious practices. Originally, early Buddhist art avoided depicting the Buddha as a person, relying on symbols like an empty throne or a footprint to represent his presence. But as Buddhism spread into regions that had been heavily influenced by Greek art, the depiction changed. Suddenly, we see the Buddha portrayed as a human figure, reflecting the Greek artistic tradition of representing gods and heroes in idealized human form. It's not just a change in artistic style, it's a deeper cultural shift in how divinity and humanity are perceived. What's also interesting is how local beliefs and deities were incorporated into Buddhism as it spread. Take Vajrapani, for example. In Buddhist iconography, he's often shown as a protector of the Buddha, but in Greco-Buddhist art, he resembles the Greek hero Hercules, muscular, powerful, and a clear symbol of strength. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it made Buddhist ideas more relatable to people familiar with Greek mythology. These kinds of adaptations show how flexible and resilient Buddhism was as it moved through different regions. The exchange wasn't limited to visual art and philosophy either. It extended to politics. The Indo-Greek kings like Menander played a huge role in this cultural blending. Their coins, for instance, often featured Buddhist symbols like the Dharma wheel alongside Greek gods like Zeus. It's easy to overlook coins, but they were powerful symbols of identity and communication at the time. By merging these images, the kings were making a clear statement about their dual heritage, balancing their Greek roots with their embrace of Buddhism. What's fascinating to me is how enduring these cultural connections were. Even after the Indo-Greek kingdoms fell and new powers, like the Kushans, rose to prominence, the influence of Greco-Buddhist art and philosophy didn't fade away. The Kushans continued to support Buddhist institutions and even commissioned artwork that reflected this fusion of styles. It's a testament to how deeply these cultural exchanges were woven into the fabric of the region. This whole process of cultural blending, Greco-Buddhism, is a reminder that identity and tradition are never static. They're constantly evolving, shaped by the people and ideas that move through a place. It's easy to look back at history and see these moments of cultural fusion as rare or exceptional, but the truth is, they've been happening all along. The story of Greco-Buddhism offers a glimpse into how interconnected the ancient world was, and it challenges the idea that East and West are distinct, separate entities. In reality, they've always been in conversation with each other, exchanging ideas and reshaping their identities in the process.